thanks everyone, and particularly to Chip Chambers for inviting me to share our thoughts on DADA2. And I really want to say that this talk should be given by Sira Nanthapasal, who's just submitted his thesis, and this is his work. Okay, let's see. So we got into this business thinking really about patients with vasculitis, and a medium vessel vasculitis that you've heard about called polyarthritis nodosa. And Sira was very keen on exploring a particular family who seemed to have a familial form of PAN, got all excited, found a variant, and then you guys beat us to it. So it's a very exciting area to be in, and also very competitive. So then, to give you some sort of background how we use this clinically when we are considering the diagnosis of polyarthritis nodosa, if that disease has very early onset, if there's a family history, or if it's sporadic but particularly severe and not really responding in the way that it should to steroids and cyclophosphamide, then we would activate our screening. In fact, more and more often we're activating our screening. I think that pretty much everyone with a severe PAN should have this test, pediatric or adult. But that's at the moment not very easy because the test is not that routine. Okay, so we've had 22 genetically confirmed DADA2 cases from the UK, and also we get some referrals from other countries as well, so not all of them are directly under our care. But really what's important is that 14 have symptoms and 8 are what we call pre-symptomatic. In other words, walking around and about, and were only discovered because there was an index case in their family who had either homozygous variants or compound het. So there are a significant proportion of folks out there who don't have any symptoms whatsoever. And we've had 17 homozygous and 5 compound heterozygous cases of those 22. 13 of them we can tell you in great detail about the phenotype, and it's nothing that you've not heard. Neurological involvement, cutaneous involvement, immunological involvement, and a few other issues, including the refractory anemia. I was very interested to hear about the Diamond Blackfan story because I'd just been asked that question yesterday from a patient in Manchester, so I think I now know the answer. The point I want to make, Marco mentioned thalidomide, and he's absolutely right. Thalidomide can target the anti-TNF pathway, but I really would not choose a medicine whose main side effect is a peripheral neuropathy, because how do you know it's the disease or it's the thalidomide? So that's maybe a point for discussion in a little bit of time. So of these pre-symptomatic cases, when you start going over them with a fine-tooth comb, you can find some signs. So they have no symptoms, but you can find signs. And some of them have very subtle livedo racemosa. One patient whose brother had one leg amputated and was about to lose the second, doing very well on anti-TNF. She's 5. She's got the same 2 compound heterozygous variants, and her only feature is some very subtle livedo racemosa affecting her left palm. She's completely asymptomatic. Now, have we done that human good? Have we converted the burden of unknowing to the burden of knowing? That's a point for discussion. So I think this is a genetic disease where there's a lot of ethical issues about uncovering genetic diagnoses in pre-symptomatic or completely asymptomatic individuals. We have used anti-TNF. These are many patients who, before the disease was discovered at a genetic level, had failed standard treatments for vasculitis and were effectively poisoned or made less well with cyclophosphamide, methotrexate, mycophenolate. Some of them had IL-6 blockade and still had strokes on IL-6 blockade. But anti-TNF, there was a clear signal. The only reason we don't use etanercept is in the vasculitis world. There was a trial in adults with ANCA vasculitis that suggested etanercept wasn't very good. So we tend to favor the monoclonal antibodies when considering TNF blockade. But I know that etanercept seems to work very well as a choice of anti-TNF. What we have not signed up to yet, and this will be a point of discussion, is treating asymptomatic individuals with lifelong anti-TNF to prevent stroke. I think that's ethically challenging. And when you ask some of these adult patients whether they want that, they've told me no. So I think this is a really interesting point for discussion. So these are the variants, and Sira, who's in the audience, has circled the new variants that we had described in our paper in arthritis and rheumatism. One of them is this upstream 5' UTR, and I think that there's going to be more of these types of variants that could explain why some individuals have only got one pathological mutation, seem to have a perfect phenotype, and you're kind of hunting for the other variant. The other layer of complexity here is that you might have one germline mutation, and you might have, in fact, a somatic mosaicism for another pathologic mutation that's missed using whichever form of screening that use Sanger sequencing. So you may require massively parallel sequencing or some in-depth next-generation sequencing technique to pick out the other variant. We've not identified that as real yet, but I'm speculating. So there are various levels of complexity. So what I really want to focus on with that preamble is this issue of DADA2 levels, either at the mRNA level, and I'm not really going to talk very much about that, but perhaps the enzyme activity in healthy humans and in other inflammatory diseases, and how do they compare with patients with confirmed genetic DADA2. So Sierra started looking at this. He wanted a functional readout, because if you find a sequence variant of unknown significance, it's, how do you know it's real? So the good news with this disease is you can look at mRNA, you can look at the enzyme activity or the level, and we've just had a lovely talk about the different ways of doing that. And what Sierra found was there was some change in the mRNA expression in healthy controls compared to patients, but this did not reach statistical significance, but it's very underpowered. But when we started splitting out the children from the adults, there were clear differences. And so from that point on, we thought that the enzyme level could actually vary in children as opposed to adults, given that this is a disease that there are children and adults, and you've been hearing all about those age spectrums. So the technique that Sierra uses, and it's a commercially available technique, we don't hold shares in this company, Diazyme, and it's really, as you've heard, it's just probes the conversion. It's the deaminase activity of adenosine deaminase, converting it to the inosine. And a bit further downstream, I'll not bore you with the chemistry of it, hydrogen peroxide is generated, and you can exploit that with a fluorochrome, so you get a color change, and you can work out the activity of the enzyme. And we measure it in serum from DADA2 patients. We've also looked at sporadic PAN patients. I'm going to tell you about 4 of the common other autoinflammatory diseases as disease controls, but then really focus on children and adults and the changes as people age. So these are some data. So this is the enzyme activity in the patients. Patients who we thought might have it, but turn out to have sporadic PAN. In other words, not the genetic form of PAN, and healthy controls. And here's the low level of activity in the patients, 18 here. Here we're carriers, and at first glance you might think, yeah, carriers, haploinsufficiency, intermediate levels. But I'm not so sure that that's the case, actually, and I'll show you why in a minute. Sporadic PAN patients, and these are controls with no comment on how old they are, okay? So then you start looking at the children versus the adults, and for this first sweep, we've just looked at children, those under the age of 18. And what you find if you've got DADA2 and you're under 18, or whether you're older, you have very low levels of the enzyme activity used in the Diazyme assay. Adult carriers are actually no different, statistically at least, from healthy adult controls, but are lower than the pediatric controls. So this is an enzyme whose activity is higher in the pediatric population. So why is that? Well, there's 2 obvious reasons. If, as has been suggested, this is a growth factor for endothelium, small humans like to grow, they need more of it around to grow more blood vessels. That's one reason. But I suspect it's a bit more complex than that. I suspect probably this is some sort of vasculoprotective mechanism that protects the vasculature against all the barrage of infections that young humans get. So I think this could be important, and therefore heterozygous state later on in life could actually be a risk factor for common or garden stroke, perhaps. And this is a plot just looking at the age, and you can see there's a clear relationship and a drop with age. And I think that's really important to remember when you're designing assays for clinical screening purposes. You need age match controls in order to interpret your data. So the question is there any difference using this assay for those who are symptomatic versus those who are asymptomatic, or depressingly pre-symptomatic, implying that they're going to get symptoms? And we can't find any statistical difference. You might argue that some of these asymptomatic individuals have slightly numeric higher levels, but I'm not convinced. I think there's no difference here. So what about using this test if you were to look at autoinflammation? Because remember, most clinicians seeing this disease are not experts in autoinflammation. They're not experts in DADA2. They want to order a test. They want a result. They want to know how it compares as opposed to other autoinflammatory diseases. And 4 of the more common of these rare autoinflammatory diseases are TRAPS, CAPS, mevalonic kinase deficiency, and familial Mediterranean fever. And in our hands, this test really is low in the patients who've got DADA2 and is unaffected in those patients with these other diagnoses. And these are age-matched adult controls, and there's absolutely no difference. We're still working through the effect of inflammation within these diseases, because maybe if your serum amyloid A, your CRP is much higher, this might affect, but we haven't found any obvious signal at the moment. So this seems very specific for the DADA2 patients. I don't need to go through that, actually. That's a story for another day. So I just want to conclude and then open up some points for discussion that I know we'll have a chance to get into in some detail. So I think we all agree that recessive mutations in this gene, Marco, you call it CHEK, I like that, CHEK, CECR1, cause monogenic vasculitis, and variable immunodeficiency with cytopenia. I was really grateful for the commentary on the diamond blackfan mimic. That really has helped us with a particular patient. So I've learned something today, thank you. But here's a really important point. This is a genetic disease with variable penetrance, and you can be completely asymptomatic. You might display signs when a clever physician goes over you with a fine tooth comb, but you as a person may be completely asymptomatic, or you may have rather subtle cutaneous findings, or you may have the full-blown disease. So the question here is, how aggressively do you treat these sorts of individuals? And more importantly, what do you do about this cohort? You've heard one approach from Amanda saying that everyone needs anti-TNF. There's two problems with that. In some countries, you can't get funding for that. So in the UK, you would not be able to fund anti-TNF. The second is some of the patients have told me they don't want it if they're completely asymptomatic. So we must take that into account. So the other issue is that you can still, if you've made it to adulthood, you can still develop symptoms. We've heard about some adult patients who get their first presentation of their DADA in adulthood, so we must remember about that. So what are the different mutations that might be modifiers? What are the as yet unidentified environmental triggers? I suspect infection could be, might vaccines. There's all sorts of things. What's the effect of smoking, for instance? These are all cardiovascular insults. There's many things that we can begin to probe in the next few years that I think will be really informative. I think we all agree that anti-TNF appears to be particularly effective, and the ADA2 levels are low in those with the disease, but also in those with asymptomatic or pre-symptomatic disease. The other autoinflammatory diseases do not affect the levels using the diazyme assay, but age does. It's higher in young people, lower in adults. So, just leave you with a few points for further discussion. Don't get too excited. We only have one treatment of the three that I'm going to talk about here. There are three potential treatments. Two of them are aspirational at the moment that could dovetail nicely given the background that I've been talking about, depending on the stage of the disease of the individual. So it would be great for those pre-symptomatic patients, rather than giving them immunosuppression for lifelong, to say, look, what you guys are going to get is a very cheap and very effective enzyme replacement therapy to prevent the onset of strokes. And my aspiration is that should be given not too often, because it's going to probably have to be given by injection. It should be cheap, and it should have no side effects. So there's the challenge. For those who then escape efficacy from that approach, and we've been in this situation doing the watchful waiting thing, definitely you rescue them with steroid, probably, anti-TNF, definitely, and be cautious with aspirin. I really enjoyed some of the commentary on anticoagulation and antiplatelet therapy. We definitely see brainstem strokes. If you can demonstrate quickly that it's a non-hemorrhagic stroke, use aspirin. We know these are feisty M1 macrophages and a hot endothelium. It makes a lot of sense to me, as long as you don't have evidence of hemorrhage that you could then make worse with hemorrhagic extension. So be cautious with aspirin. Think about it, though. Plus or minus, carry on with your very cheap, very effective enzyme replacement therapy whilst making arrangements for gene therapy. So these are all points of discussion. I'll stop there. Thank you.